Hello everyone, today we talk about politics at the court of Leopold I of Habsburg during 1681, in function actually of our series of videos about Vienna 1683. So a bit the diplomatic context actually at this point, international politics in Europe and especially the French influence in all this picture, and in fact in relation mostly to Habsburgic policy. And the factions that existed at the same Habsburgic court in this sense. Right. So we start from the Diet of Edinburgh, right? That is today's sovereign in Hungary at the border with Austria, right? This is fairly well documented. We're talking about December 1681. Right? At this point, Leopold I had restored a constitutional government in Royal Hungary that was this basically northwestern stripe of historical Hungary that belonged at this point to the Habsburgs, right, while the rest was fundamentally under the Ottoman control, and without perhaps at least realizing that as an emperor that at this point it was too late to try to negotiate simply from a diplomatic point of view with these lands, right? This assize was actually very complex, tiring, and its results hadn't satisfied properly anyone, but the parts had convened that to Royal Hungary would have been left a large autonomy, right? Differently from what had happened, for example, in the case of Bohemian. We'll see maybe another time. And in fact, the Bohemian model would have been perhaps more, appreciated by the shortly passed General Feldmarschall Montecuccoli, that in fact had died the year before, and who had always been, had always agreed with the Jesuits to treat the least as possible, to negotiate the least as possible with the Protestant Magyars, right? Among the various problems, naturally, of the Habsburgic government of these lands was the confessional one. It was obviously weaponized from a political point of view. But exactly regarding to this aspect, the Papal nuncio Bonvisi at this point, the activity of whom had been actually determining for the summoning of the same diet, and had conditioned skillfully its work, was definitely instead way more oriented for negotiation, right? It appeared secondary the fact that more or less in that same time the influence of the French ambassador in Warsaw, accompanied by a lot of gold, had avoided that the Polish magnates would pronounce explicitly in favor of an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor. So Leopold was worried, in fact, especially by Hungary, right? And he counted on the fact that the negotiation that had been relaunched in spring 1681 with Turk, right? You know who he was. He was this very prominent Hungarian magnate. He was negotiating in many ways his own crown with the Ottomans over Hungary in an anti-Habsburgic function, but still obviously playing on both sides depending on the circumstances. And there was this group of the so-called discontents, right? On the base of the guarantees decided by the Diet that wouldn't reach altogether an agreement. So this was instead fundamental in the perspective of the organization of a campaign against the Ottomans that the Habsburgs were toying with, ideally, that however was unthinkable at this point with a non-pacified Hungary that would have turned easily into a fifth column for the Turks, right? And the situation there was pretty messed up because it was a frontier area where there were so many different powers, smaller powers, and it was dramatically fluid and very difficult to control. Papal had followed the work of the Diet of Edinburgh with interest and satisfaction in a growing manner, had been instead Pope Innocent XI, right? And he had remained so satisfied by it at the point of granting on September the 1st to Bonvisi the Cardinal Purpur, right, with the title of Saint Stephen of the Chelym, without, however, that this could entail also, contrarily to the usage of the time, the abandonment of those diplomatic functions in the exercise of which the newly appointed cardinal, with all his sincere commitment, had up to that point obtained kind of average, mediocre results, right? So instead now, with the Diet of Edinburgh, the great success seemed to have arrived. And just in time, because if the Pope had waited for another week to seal his sub annulo piscatoris, his decision, perhaps he would have thought about it twice, right? On September 19th, in fact, in Vienna, arrived unexpectedly and suddenly the news that the Count Turkely, after many wavering, and evidently comforted also by the support and by the money of the King of France, right, had made his choice, breaking finally the truce and actually resuming arms with a remarkable army strengthened by an Ottoman contingent of about 7,000 Turks, supported by 12,000 among Moldavians and Wallachians that were vassals of the Sublime Porte. Right, French money was very important. Right, it is evident that Louis XIV at this point had actually no interest proper to yet weaken the hereditary possessions of Leopold I, nor to encourage an Ottoman advance by itself. In a certain sense, on the contrary, he just hoped actually properly a strong imperial reaction to the Ottoman offensive, right, and one of the Ottoman allies, and all what the French king actually intended to obtain was to put the Holy Roman Emperor in the objective, let's say, military moral conditions, not to fight but against the Ottomans, and perhaps also committing against the Hungarian rebels, so that the French could instead be free to operate in the Rhineland. This is very important. The discontents that were probably this, part of those Hungarians that took arms, right, against the Habsburgs at this point, were supported, as we have seen, by the Ottomans, by the Tatars, right. It had already been there from a while, right. The French ambassador Sebeville had announced it to the King of France since July the 24th, right. But the fact that Hungary had not been truly ever definitely pacified, this is this important thing overall, because it was difficult in that area to distinguish between modest movements, let's say occasional raids, and true and proper military campaigns coordinated by the rebel forces with the foreign support. This is typical of very unstable areas naturally, and of course there was a lot of movement always because of all these various magnates, their interests, their conflicting interests, and mostly also fighting against each other. But at that point it's difficult to understand properly what's going on. And before the if the region would have been completely pacified, you would have seen these movements. Okay, they're planning something, and there's probably some external intervention for it. Now, this thing could kind of, this strategical set could mask broader movements supported by the Ottomans. And already since July and August, the Holy Roman Emperor had ordered a good levy of infantrymen and dragoons to counter the new offense. At this point, so this contest is looking at this rebel army. There were Muslims, Lutherans, Calvinists, Orthodox, to which went also the sympathy of the local Jewish communities, right, which is a very good example of the Balkanic confessionalism in many ways. So this is also those people who think this was a war of religion. You have Muslims, Lutherans, Calvinists, Orthodoxes, and even Jewish support. You need, it's not there. It's Catholics that, however, were surely present, also in smaller numbers. And this army had attacked on September the 15th the small fortress of Kalo in eastern Hungary, and this risked to determine the fall of Zsatmár and all what remained, basically, in that strategic theaters in the hands of the Imperials. Right. This is kind of also, an area, is mountainous. It's along the Carpathians, so it's actually tough to control. That there's not a dramatic, it's all scattered centers, garrisons, and it becomes very complex even just to stem specific attacks to every single fortress. And in order to hold the front, the Habsburgs dispose, at least on paper, at this point, of a number of perhaps slightly superior effectives, right? But they were all scattered. There were something like 20,000 men, 20,000 troops proper, soldiers, to which had to be added the frontier garrisons, some scattered battalion, 13,000 cavalrymen, and 7 infantry regiments that in total would have, made something like 17,500 men, right? But these forces were largely non-combat ready in many ways, and this fragile situation was addressed with lucid awareness, actually, for what it really was. But perhaps exactly for this, it was realized it was too late. And in fact, on August the 30th, the Imperial died, following finally and fully the advice and the repeated recommendations of the Prince Montecuccoli that had shortly passed away, had voted in Regensburg the establishment of a permanent army of the empire, right, constituted by contingents that would have had to be around 40,000 men, right, provided and maintained by the various Kaiser districts in which the imperial territory was subdivided. But this was again like a decision that remained largely on paper. In September, Leopold established that the effective infantry regiments had to be brought from 2,500 to 3,000, and in the following month he organized a pair of cuirassiers regiments and some other dragoons and of infantry. But the diets, the various councils of the countries belonging to the Habsburgic dynastic possessions, and we're talking about Low Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia, refused to pay the necessary supplementary credits, and especially because they didn't want to grant on their territories the places and spaces to billet the troops. That was actually, the greatest scourge of those times for these communities. And in doing this, the Kaiser of the empire didn't actually behave differently. For example, the French ambassador in Vienna witnessed that the envoy of the Swabian Kreis had declared that his people would have preferred to host Ottoman militias rather than imperial troops. This was kind of the spirit of the time. And in that moment, therefore, the Habsburgs of Austria began to, feel as if between two fires, and it would have been difficult to avoid thinking that the French would have tried this pincer movement together with the Ottomans and the Hungarian rebels, right, against the Habsburgic domains. And almost right after this bad news from Hungary, the Habsburgs had been informed that on September the 30th, the troops of the Sun King had entered the imperial city of Strasbourg, right, taking possession of it according to the unilateral deliberation of the so-called Chambre de Réunion in Metz. This was a series of, approving dispositions from the side of Kingdom of France to say, okay, we took control of the center. These were imperial lands, right? Strasbourg. I mean, today it's Strasbourg in Alsace, but this is probably the age in which that was taken from Germany and coming to be a part of the French possessions. So this is the whole thing is interesting because actually, for example, the Catholics of the Alsatian, center, the main center of Alsace, Strasbourg, were, rather happy of the fact that the Catholic French had seized. Germany had come out only from essentially a couple of generations out of the 30 Years' War that had sanctioned actually the difference, the confessional differences that still existed. It wasn't, the same situation, of course, of the war that had been devastating, but there were still bitter differences on that ground. Even presumably, at least, the Holy See was satisfied because the Pope knew that Louis would have been much harsher with the Alsatian Protestants than what up to that point the same Leopold I had been. Right, the Holy Roman Imperial policy was a freaking total mess. Of course, it was a continuous balance for all these various, local equilibriums, let's say, and the emperor wasn't this great power at all. Couldn't be so harsh and iron-fisted like the way more powerful French, if he didn't want to see the whole Germany rising up against him, right? And the situation was serious because, for example, at this point on September, the same 30th of September 1681, the French had occupied also Casale in Montferrat in northwestern Italy on the base of a convention with the Duke of Mantua, which was an imperial vassal, by the way, and albeit this was mostly a move concerning, that the French had made against Spain rather than Austria, Leopold was, as a Holy Roman Emperor, was formally, committed into this because, he in fact held the royal crown of Italy, and he was eminent sovereign also in the same Mantuan Dutch, right? So, to make long story short, the imperial rights were once again stepped over by someone. So the situation was really clear in many ways internationally at this point. So, especially after the French capture of Strasbourg, the other three cities of the empire, which as Strasbourg was, right, here we're talking about specifically Ulm, Köln, Cologne, feared the arrival of the French. Naturally, there wasn't a univocal appreciation from the French. It was like half and half. But within them, there were also, and obviously for the same logic, many people that instead wished the French arrival. The capture of Strasbourg could also mark the beginning of the launch of a systematic offensive all over the right bank of the Rhine by the side of the French. You know that Germany and Italy at this point were starting being called the weak areas of Europe, because they were all fragmented, many states, especially Germany and the French, since the 30 Years' War had, but even before, since the Wars of Italy, and had, as the major continental power, had after the Ottomans technically, had began to seize, to fish, let's say, just next door, right, to the Rhine, in this very permeable German region. Small states couldn't impose themselves without the support of another major force against the French, right? That role was here in the hands of the emperor, but also these were imperial vassals, so you should have thought about it partially themselves. And it was at this point well understood that the interpretation of the documents examined by the Chambre de Réunion was arriving to allow the conclusion that the three dioceses of Metz, Toul, and Verdun belonged by law to the territory subordinated to the sovereignty of the King of France, and that the passage from the solemn juridical declaration to the military occupation would have been just a matter of time. And in fact, actually, the formal claiming of the three dioceses would have happened in spring 1682. But within the German world, let's say the Imperial world, the opinions relatively to the attitude and the demands of Louis XIV were very different. The Prince Elector of Mainz, Franz von Ingelheim, didn't want to hear anything about resistance against the French, because his own territory had been ravaged during the Dutch War, and he had lost 200,000 florins of revenue. He disposed of a ridiculous army, basically, and he was, among the other things, happy that the city of Strasbourg had ended up in the hands of the most Christian king of France, rather than instead to one of the Protestant heretics, as much as it had, actually been possible to happen. The Prince Elector of Cologne, declared himself worried, but not in the condition to react, and it was well known, actually, that he was a friend of Louis XIV. And regarding Maximilian Emanuel, Elector of Bavaria, that was, in fact, brother-in-law to the Grand Dauphin, had heard to congratulate with his relative, the King of France. You know that the Grand Dauphin, Louis of Bourbon, 1661-1711, known as Monseigneur, had, in fact, shortly before married Mary Anna of Bavaria, who was sister of Maximilian Emanuel, and she would be known, in fact, from that point too, as the Grande Dauphine. And in August 1682, the Augustin couple had the joy and the glory to make Louis XIV grandfather with the birth of Louis, to whom was attributed the title of Duke of Burgundy, and that actually would have died 30 years afterwards, not even, in that terrible year that brought so many mourning, actually, to the, at that point, old Louis XIV, who towards the end of his life, lost an incredible amount of affections, including his son, and this was also, as you know, a very important problem for Europe because of his succession in all this stuff. And nor Louis XIV naturally lacked the opportunity to show the German princes openly, but also and especially hiddenly, right, his own favor. Right, he sent to them conspicuous subsidies that were burst by him actually to the Duke of Hanover, for example, that were often, at least, that were eventually transported from France to Saxony in barrels of alcoholic beverages that were, cunningly prepared as such by the Hofjude Lefman barons for this specific purpose. As as we have seen, this fragmented Germany ever since France had reborn multiple times, actually, between the Middle Ages and the modern age, as the main Christian power in Europe had been extremely sensitive to French influence, whereas the Holy Roman Emperor was basically a prince among the others. At this point, objectively the most powerful in Germany, but still actually also building, as you know, as it's with the or as it would be for the Hohenzollern, actually outside Germany proper, and actually even the boundaries of the empire. Just think about Hungary or the other territories of Eastern Europe for the Prussians and so on. So as the Venetian ambassador in Vienna, Domenico Contarini, observed in one of his dispatches to the Venetian Senate, the disorientation and the confusion among Leopold's counselors reunited in the Gerheimer Conference were at this point undescribable. The Gerheimer Conference was this, literally secret conference that, to just like very few people attended, which some of the highest decisions of imperial policy were taken, and we know this thing from dispatches from, in fact, about the secret conference in which we know that Leopold I didn't actually just listen to his maximum organ of government, but also private counselors, usually religious men, as it would be evident for Aviano, but as we will see now also for Imre Sinelli, right? And that he also took in very important account the Spanish ambassador that was very influential too at this point. In Hungary, the imperial troops commanded by the General Silvio Enea Caprara were collecting only defeats, right? And at this point, in front of the Hungarian Ottoman armies was opened, freed and flattened the way for Strasbourg, right? And it was logical, awaiting in a while actually the siege of that stronghold. That Strasbourg is today's Bratislava. It's a very few tens of kilometers from Vienna, and that would have been an enormous loss, a great problem. So, of the opinions and the moods that agitated in that moment around Leopold I and inside his Gerheimer Conference, we maintain a perhaps subjective but definitely very wide and deep picture, thanks to the abundant and detailed relations of the ambassadors in Vienna, especially the one of the French Sebeville and of the Venetian Contarini. You can read most of this stuff, for example, in Béranger and Gherardi, that wrote both in 1981 this collections. The conference at this point was attended by the Chancellor of Austria, Johann Paul Hocher, Baron of Hohenkamm, who was a good jurist but often absent the reunions because he was sick with gout, as many noblemen at this time, and he was the iron-fisted policymaker, we can say, in Hungary, and at the same time he was hostile to France, so very uncompromising at an international level, in a sense. Instead, the Prince Johann Adolf von Schwarzenberg was president of the Reichshofrat, was moderate and a pragmatic. He knew perfectly all the balances of this quasi-monstrum, right, and yet mirabile monstrum that the Holy Roman Empire was at this point, and he was a cautious supporter of the necessity of an agreement with France instead. And this exchange of views is definitely fascinating, and more or less in the same terms of the latter thought also the Count Leopold Wilhelm Königsegg Rothenfels, who was vice-chancellor of the empire. He was a Swabian that was deemed a creature of the Prince-Elector Archbishop of Mainz, and as such he was Philo-French, but he was very appreciated by Leopold, and it should be stressed that hostile to an affirmation of the Sun King in the Rhineland was not much the princes and the cities of the empire, right, that were actually directly interested in the thing, as we have seen, albeit in various ways, but in fact they were fundamentally favorable to a settlement, an agreement that would have granted them to live in peace. That's what they wanted, and that in fact very often figured on Louis XIV's payroll, but rather the supporters of a strong unity of action between the two branches of the Habsburgic house were evidently adverse to the affirmation of the sovereign in the problems of the dynastic possessions of Austria and Bohemia, and therefore basically of an abandonment or an overlooking of the western sector, right? So it was mostly like within Habsburgic problem themselves, right? They were worried about that not enough action would have been taken to counter the French expansionism in the East, and in this sense, in the West, and in this sense we have to take into account the double institutional aspect of the, let's say, Habsburgic Imperial, whatever you want to call them, group at this point, was constituted by various realities that basically sided and integrated each other all the time, that albeit being distinguished, and the interests of which did not actually overlap, definitely understood the importance of having a common direction. Leopold I of Habsburg was officially, as his official title sounded like, by grace of God, Roman Emperor elected, right, King of Germany, and also King of Bohemia, Hungary, and Archduke of Austria. The imperial crown depended, as we know, on the election by the side of the elector princes that granted the one of Germany. So at this point, the elected assumed the title of King of the Romans, a would-be emperor, right? And as such, he had automatically the right to go take the imperial crown that after Frederick III, that had been crowned in 1452, had actually never been outside of the Habsburgic dynasty, right, the hereditary archdukes of Austria. And the kingdom of Bohemia, or of St. Wenceslas, as it was known, was up to 1620 elective and vassal of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Its sovereign was famously elector prince of the empire, but after a period of constitutional exception, let's say, exceptionality, it had become also an hereditary monarchy of the house of the Archdukes of Austria. And that's why also Montecuccoli wanted to extend the same, asset to the same policy, let's say, that existed in Bohemia onto Hungary, Royal Hungary, the Habsburgic-dominated Hungary. Also considered that to the Kingdom of Bohemia belonged the March of Moravia. Then the Kingdom of Hungary, as we have seen, of particularly a complex history and borders, was an elective monarchy that comprehended, besides today's Hungary, also the historical regions of Slovakia, that was known at the time as Upper Hungary, of Subcarpatic Ukraine, of Transylvania, that is today's part of Romania, famously enough, and of even today's Austrian Burgenland, of Croatia, of Slavonia, and part of Dalmatia, right? And but between, however, the half of the 16th century and the 80s of the 17th, the lowlands and the southern part of the country, that is basically the entire today's Hungary, right, had become a pashalik, right, an Ottoman pashalik with the capital in Buda. Well, just the north of the country, as we were saying before, that had been an autonomous kingdom up to 1102, and eventually blended together with one of Hungary, had remained Royal Hungary. So it was not a mere repartition that the Habsburgs and the Ottomans eventually agreed on after that. Hungary was knocked out in the 16th century. That was, as such, technically still an elective crown, right? It was practically constituted by the Banate of Croatia. The Banate was the governor, was appointed by the king, traditionally, at least for Hungary. And it had its own diet that was summoned habitually in Pressburg, that today is Bratislava, as I was saying before, and of today's Slovakia. And Royal Hungary was governed by a palatine, so-called, elected by a diet of Hungarian magnates on, proposal of the king. And since 1527, eventually the Hungarian elective crown had been, as much as the Imperial one, with which, it didn't have any institutional tie, historically speaking, always an appanage of the House of Habsburg. And October the 31st, 1687, after the definitive freeing of Buda from the Ottomans, the states of the kingdom, reunited in Pressburg, had proclaimed the hereditary crown of Hungary, right, of the dynasty of Habsburg, right, while the Principality of Transylvania was governed by a voivode, who was elected by his own diet, was essentially an autonomous vassal of the Ottomans up to 1691, right? This is a bit just to keep the coordinates to this reality. Then, speaking of the Gerheimer Conference, also, it was attended by other influential members of the government and councillors of the emperor, such as the Marshal of Court, Count Albert von Zinzendorf, right? He was like an ambiguous character, according to Sebeville. Hermann, Markgraf of Baden-Durlach, president of the Hofkriegsrat, an office that had been held by Montecuccoli up to 1680, that is, up to the time he had remained into this, kind of ballet of tears, and the Baron Christoph von Abel, who was president of the Reichskammergericht, the chamber of the Imperial Tribunal, had been created by the Habsburgs as the greater legislative authority of the empire for previous centuries. A very important institution. And both the Markgraf of Baden, as much as von Abelen, were characters, let's say that both are, a bit for matters of age or scarce health or weak character, actually, not very energetic, right? And for this reason, they were also decisively influenced by Father Imre Zinelli. It was an Hungarian, right, of humble origins that had entered in the Capuchin family of the Franciscan order and Bishop of Vienna since 1680, right? And the name in German is actually Emmerich, right? And was orderly known with the German form of his baptism name rather than with the Hungarian one of Imre, in fact, as we instead call him here. And Imre Sinelli, had been one of the characters that the emperor loved listening to the most. He was a supporter of a line of firmness towards France, but at the same time also of the research of an agreement with the various social and religious forces present in Royal Hungary, right? And he deemed as necessary, agreeing with Cardinal Bonvisi, for example, to provide especially the pacification of Royal Hungary. And in this, he opposed to the solutions inspired by a Catholic intransigence, supported instead by a very powerful prelate and influent counselor of the sovereign, the Bishop Leopold Kolonix, who he 1643-1707 descended by a Croatian military family. He was actually son of a converted Lutheran and became pupil of the Cardinal Pazzamani, and just like him, he consecrated totally to the cause of the triumph of counter-reformistic Catholicism in Hungary. He was raised at the court of Vienna, and he was actually destined to the Hospitallers, to the Order of Malta. And in fact, he had participated when he was barely a young man in 1655 to the campaign of Candia on the galleys of the religion, as it was the same order. The Hospitalier order was canonically was usually known with the, in fact, canonically correct name of religio in Latin, that is the regular order, right? And after this, Leopold I had granted Leopold Kolonix the bishoprics of Nitra in Upper Hungary, was important diocese, and he had led also rigorous theological studies in Vienna before his consecration that happened in 1668, and he was most faithful to the Habsburgic house, hostile to the Hungarians, right? Generally speaking, the Croatians and the Hungarians didn't like very much each other throughout a lot of time, this context, as however, in this case, chiefly because they were heretics and rebels, and especially he hated magnates, right? He understood the political business of it and how they were trying naturally to play with the Ottomans for their own interests in this regard. And he had backed and prosecuted with, convinced firmness actually Montecuccoli's line, right? That that united him to the common antipathy towards the Magyars, actually. And he was eventually Bishop of Wiener Neustadt in 1670, and he held afterwards other offices. He was appointed Cardinal in 1688, and he also received the task to reorganize the newly acquired Hungarian territories. For all these reasons, within the advisors of Leopold I, Kolonix was full agreement with the Company of Jesus, right? This policy of intransigent Catholicism to be imposed, especially on Royal Hungary. And according to Sinelli, the research for a settlement of the tensions in Hungary was necessary exactly because the emperor could concentrate on the problem of French expansionism and adequately counter it, right? And the harsh line proposed by Kolonix would have, according to him, irreparably sown new reciprocal rancors and rendered impossible the achievement of a safe point of agreement that could be acceptable and defendable loyally by all parts involved. It's furthermore obvious that the two delineable parties, especially through the relations of the French resident, the Marquis de Zebeville, that kind of abstracted from the existence of at court of a French crypt party, or at least that preferred to dissemble the role of its adepts, and after all, hidden within the ranks of the German one, right? They don't correspond to two frontally opposed factions, right? Between each other, and also nor rigorously compacted within themselves, as we've just seen. It was general and common example to all the imperial councillor, the expression of a harsh judgment that was perhaps not always sincere towards the policy of the Chambre de Réunion proposed by Louis XIV. It was considered a group violation of law, of kind of quibbling, captious pretexts supported by the military prepotence, and of the unjustified interference of the French in the matters of imperial pertinence. And within those that belonged to the German party prevailed anyhow the worry for the Hungarian situation was not just serious by itself, but that could have served as a model for the rise of something similar to what was happening in Bohemia, where surely the reasons for tension and discontent didn't lack, and where in fact in 1680 had broken out a violent peasant revolt against the harshness of the seigneurial regime, right? And also because naturally of the eventuality, as it would happen in 3 years, of a new Ottoman offensive, as we've seen, came a bit out of the blue. I mean, of course, there would be enough time to prepare, but as we've seen in the video we made titled Turkish March, Vienna 1683, where we talk about the preparations, specifically the Ottoman campaign, there was no adequate, even expectation, an attitude and mentality in some ways, because of all these, frictions that paralyzed the same imperial court at certain levels. Right. For what concerns the Bohemian revolt, that's interesting because Leopold issued an imperial patent that tried in 1681 to soften, let's say, those burdens over the peasantry, that fixed to 3 days a week the corvée duty. Right. That is to say, for more than half a week, sometimes peasants were coerced to work for free, and you understand how exploited they were in that sense, and how actually in Bohemia also the various noblemen did whatever they liked in that regard, and this general worry posed naturally, first and foremost, in foreground, let's say, the needs of peace and security, both of the Reich and also, of course, of the Habsburgic hereditary domains. Other dignitaries and functionaries of court had, as a principal reason, a perspective that ended up to advise the research for an agreement with France that was based on the awareness that was actually very politically realistic regarding naturally of the incredible military potential possessed by the Sun King, right, that at the time could count for what it seems, or roughly 140,000 men ready to be deployed. Right, so this is like 3 or 4 times the ones that the empire could put together. Right, they were even better armed, trained, more disciplined. Sun King was creating the first modern army proper, right, and especially they were effectively already available for war. Right, France didn't have to negotiate that anymore. There was a statal army now, and differently from the imperial contingents. If you needed to use that, you still had to debate at the Diet of Regensburg, like at that point, and considered that France was obviously and easily and by far the single most powerful Christian power in Europe, right? The empire could not match it alone. So there was a neat disparity of opinion that reigned also about the measures to take towards the Hungarians, right? The makers of the soft line, albeit hesitating, justified themselves with the fear that a contrary choice could actually strengthen even more the alliance between the rebels and the Ottomans, and with the perspective that a remissive but steady solution of the Hungarian problem would have allowed the to deal without losing other time, and definitely with greater serenity to cope with the French expansionism. But the most decided supporters of the so-called Spanish party, that was common to them, or in good or bad faith, let's say, a certain overlooking of the Ottoman problem, right? And surely some of them, the most decided supporters of this so-called Spanish party, was common among them in good or bad faith, tended to underestimate the Ottoman threat. But as much as there was, at least in appearance, a general agreement in line of principle as a severe judgment of the Sun King's policy, there was also a certain identity of views reigning relatively about the Turk, right? Here the impression that the Sultan would have confirmed or renewed the truce signed in 1664 at Basbar appeared spread and shared, right? Even though not everybody was convinced, but as we were saying before, this is what eventually would trick, right? The Habsburgs, with a in a balance, it became dramatically risky, as Vienna did risk to be taken very, very easily. So the Spanish party was naturally coordinated by the same ambassador of Spain. It was Carlo Emanuele d'Este, Marquis of Borgomanero, that had arrived in Vienna in May 1681, more or less contemporary to the French Zébéville. And he enjoyed the authoritative support of he who felt himself as the first damaged by the policy of the Chambre de Réunion, that was Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, that had succeeded to Montecuccoli in the office of Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Army, and as you know, in fact, would actually also lead the one at the Battle of Vienna. Charles was born on April the 3rd, 1643, and died on April the 1869. Right, he was since 1675 the title holder of the Duchy of Lorraine, occupied by the French, though. The thing was extremely long, and the French took almost 1 century to secure Lorraine as such. And he had fought when he was 21 years old at the Battle of St. Gotthard, right, 1664, together with Montecuccoli, and he had eventually accompanied the General Spark, achieving when he was 33 the rank, obtaining the rank of Feldmarschall in 1676. Right. So this is more or less the picture on this, let's say, French, say, influence, of course, in the not just on the affairs of Germany, but properly in the reaction that this caused within the imperial milieu, and the political consequences that this would bring, right? So naturally, as you understand, we are intensifying the contents about the 1683 siege of Vienna, and this is all very importantly part of the whole background. For now, we'll stop it here. We'll continue this some other time, and for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.